Okay, now our second reading comes from the letter to the Colossians, the letter of St. Paul to the Colossians, chapter 2, verses 12 through 14. Brothers and sisters, you were buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the power of God, who raised him from the dead. And even when you were dead in transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he brought you to life along with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions, obliterating the bond against us with its legal claims, which was opposed to us. He also removed it from our midst, nailing it to the cross. Okay, short reading, which is great because the first reading and the gospel are pretty long, so we got this nice short reading, and it's not really connected at all with the first reading or the gospel. So what's going on? So in verse 11, this is kind of a strange thing. Well, let's go back. In verse 9, St. Paul is just talking about Jesus and how in Jesus dwells the fullness of the deity in his bodily form. So Jesus is fully God. And he says then in verse 10, and you share in this fullness in him. So this gets to like what he talks about pretty regularly, but especially in 1 Corinthians 12, how we are made members of the body of Christ, that we are grafted onto him. And so we share not just like in the salvation that he gave to us, of course, but we share in his identity, in his very identity. So in him, we share the fullness of him, which is incredible, who is the head of every principality and power. So the principalities and powers are like angelic creatures, angelic choirs of angels. In him you were also circumcised with a circumcision not administered by hands. So this is a big deal. So for the Colossians, most of them are Gentiles, and so they're trying to figure out how does this work with like baptism and circumcision and that kind of thing? Because we know from other letters of Paul that there were people who came along and said that, look, if the Gentiles want to be Christians, that's great. If they want to follow Jesus, that's great. They need to be circumcised first. They need to be Jewish first because the Christian faith came to us through the Jewish faith, the Jewish religion. And so they need to first become Jewish so that they can become Christian. And so that's what some people are going around teaching this and preaching this. And so there's a debate, actually. We heard about this during the Easter season. I forget when exactly it was, but it's from Acts chapter 15, where they had the Council of Jerusalem, and they had to debate about what exactly did this mean. And so Paul is talking like, look, you actually were circumcised, because to become Jewish, the way for doing that for a male, anyways, was to be circumcised. That was like, so the mark of circumcision was the way that people could see that you were Jewish, or people could understand that you were Jewish. So then it's like, okay, well, what about being Christian? So St. Paul says, you were circumcised with him, in him, with a circumcision not administered by hand. Well, what is that circumcision? So in other words, he's saying there is a way to enter into this covenant relationship. And that is where we get into our second reading, where he says, you were buried with him in baptism. This is the new circumcision, is baptism. In which you were also raised with him through faith in the power of God who raised him from the dead. So baptism, when we are baptized, the Lord has supplied such grace that when we are baptized, we are crucified with Christ and we are raised with him to glory. So you can imagine the priest or the deacon or whoever pouring water over the person or dunking that person in the water. What's happening? They're being buried. You think of like, this isn't dirt, but it's water. But if it was dirt, I would be doing what? I would be throwing dirt over the dead person, burying them. But then when they are lifted up from the font of baptism, what happens? They are resurrected. So your baptism day is your crucifixion and your resurrection day. So that's what Paul is getting at here. So you were buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the power of God who raised him from the dead. And even when you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he brought you to life along with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions. So this is like an important thing. So this is true whether a person is Jewish or whether a person is Gentile, as the Colossians are. So St. Paul talks about this, the uncircumcision of your flesh. They were not circumcised physically in a fleshly way. So because they're Gentiles. And yet at the same time, the Lord brought life to them, even in the uncircumcision of their flesh, even in their transgressions, their deadness in their transgressions. He brought them to life because he forgave them their transgressions. He obliterated the bond against them with its legal claims, obliterated it. That's like important. Like, okay, so what happens? Because because of original sin, we are born into this world in that state, separated from God, slaves of the devil. We have bonds against us. You think of this, a person who's born into the family of a slave. It's like, okay, well, I can't help. I was born into this. And there's certain legal requirements that come with this of like my parents are, I mean, I'm my parents' child, but my master owns me because I'm his slave. I'm the son of slaves. And so I'm bound up in this. And it says here that Jesus obliterated that bond so that those who are baptized, those who are crucified with Christ and raised with him to glory through baptism, that bond is obliterated with its legal claims. The devil no longer has a claim on me, but now I have been given over to a good Father who grants me the freedom to love him as I need to, which was opposed. So these legal claims were opposed to us. He also removed it from our midst, nailing it to the cross. How is it that he obliterated these bonds? He took them. He took the papers that were ours, that listed off our identity, not as sons of God or not as daughters of God, but as slaves of the devil. He took those papers and he nailed them to the cross. You think of this, the sign that was put above Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. This is the claim made against him. This is the reason for his crucifixion. But in so many ways, you could put your own name there. And Jesus takes it and he pounds it on the cross and he says, this is what I think of your claims. I bring them with me into death, into my sacrifice to the Father, and I bring them with me into my resurrection, obliterating the claims that they have, but instead giving your name to my Father, writing your name in my book of life. That's what's going on. And so what's actually really cool about this is that this is in the early days of the church. This is one of the passages that Christians spoke about. So specifically Colossians 2, verses 11 and 12. In those verses, and I suppose around there, but specifically those verses, Christians spoke of those verses when talking about the baptism of infants. Because who were the circumcised ones in the Jewish religion? Well, they were circumcised after 8 days. So they were circumcised while they were infants. And so what was happening is some Christians were understanding like, okay, well, we got to wait 8 days to baptize them because this is the new circumcision. And so sometimes Christian leaders would write about how you don't have to wait 8 days. You can baptize your baby right away to bring them into the new circumcision, which brings them into the new life, the new creation, the new covenant that is found in Jesus. So that's a really, I don't know, it's just kind of a neat point here that this understand, because there's some Christians around. This is why I suppose it's neat. There's some Christians today who would say, well, we shouldn't baptize infants because we need to make them, or we need to let them make that choice for themselves. And the early church understood, like, no, that's not really what is going on here. The Lord desires even infants to be baptized. Just like he desired infants to be circumcised and brought into the family, so too when infants are born into the Christian family, they are meant to be brought to the new circumcision as soon as possible, to be brought into baptism so that they can die with Christ and rise with him and have those bonds obliterated, have those legal claims obliterated, nailed to the cross of Christ with him and rising then and being brought into the family, brought into the eternal kingdom. So anyways, that maybe can be helpful for you if you have that conversation, just to understand. You can even say, I don't know the sources, but I know that early Christians baptized infants, and they understood that this is what the Lord desired. Just as he desired the circumcision of infants in ancient Israel, so too he desires the new circumcision of infants in the new Israel, in his church. That's an incredible thing. And you can find at least an understanding of that in Colossians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, and maybe a little bit surrounding there, but especially 11 and 12. Okay, there we go. I hope and pray this was great and helpful for you, the 17th Sunday in Ordinary Time, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Peace.